Hello, listeners, and welcome to Fighting Failure. Today's episode of the conservation section is all about palm oil. I'm your host, Sandhya Stapleton.
I'm your co-host, Oscar Archibald, and this is my understudy, Taryn, who is subbing in for Hisho in this episode.
Hi, great to be here.
So this episode is styled to be a bit more of a discussion, so we're going to be putting in points as we go, and the show notes are more like guidelines. This is a super important topic, so let's jump into it. Starting with, what is palm oil? So palm oil is an edible vegetable oil made from the fruit oil of a palm tree, and it's used in so many different products everywhere in the world.
So it is, I guess, very much like any other oil. So maybe like olive oil or sunflower oil or rapeseed oil, canola oil, all these sort of different oils. Palm oil is just another one of those, except it's much cheaper than many of them in many cases. So palm oil production looks like it's been on a steady increase. Wait, what happened? What did I press? I pressed the citation button. That's not good. So in 1961, it was around 1 million tons by the look of it. But by 2018, which is when the statistic was released, it was up to 70 million tons. So that is a 70-fold increase by the look of it. But also, if you look at the vegetable oil production in the whole world, you can see that palm oil is right at the top of that graph.
The highest palm oil production is Indonesia.
And we'll link this page in the description if you want to have a look at the statistics for yourself. So the next thing here is sneaky names for palm oil. There's actually a huge consumer awareness for the environmentally unfriendliness for palm oil. I think a survey of UK adults said about half thought that or just less than half, thought that palm oil was the most environmentally unfriendly vegetable oil. And to hide this, some companies use sneaky names other than palm oil. So I think let's all just pick a favorite. I'm just going to go straight up and say vegetable oil. It seems in many under regulation, you're allowed to not specify the specific type of vegetable oil. You can just say vegetable oil. And so many times I've seen this, it just says vegetable oil. I remember one time I was buying biscuits at Chipiku, which is the supermarket in Malawi. And at that time we were just like completely boycotting palm oil. And I was like, oh, it's not palm oil, it's vegetable oil. And my mum was like, yeah, no, that's palm oil. By being non-specific, that is a way of them just sort of saying that.
It's incredible how when you start to look into these things, how many of these everyday products that you use actually contain quite high quantities sometimes of palm oil. And you can see how that industry's really grown in the shadows because of that.
Yeah, for sure. Taran, do you want to pick another one?
Palm kernel? That would have fooled me.
But I guess the thing there is it's a bit easier. It does have the word palm. So maybe the first 16 of these or 15 have palm in them. So some like palmitate, octyl palmitate, ethyl palmitate, palm fruit oil, kernel oil. Those are palmate. There's loads of these that all have like palm somewhere in the word. And then you get to the ones that are being a lot more sort of sneaky, like stearate or stearic acid. So all of these are just other names for palm oil. And it's the same sort of thing that the industry does with sugar, like splitting it up into glucose syrup and sugar to make them all sort of lower down on the list. But there's actually 5 different sources for sugar, and they say glucose instead of sugar or fructose syrup or something like that, just to fool you and make you sort of want to buy these unhealthy foods.
Glycerol, that sounds like something like, if I looked at a package, I would think, oh, glycerol, that's probably some kind of sugar, because you've got all the other names for sugar as well.
Well, I guess glycerol sounds a bit more like a fat in that you have the triglyceride, so that glyc sort of thing generally seems to mean. So I suppose this leads into our first problem, which is how incredibly hard it is to avoid. It's so cheap, it's so useful. The problem is that we're battling against something that's actually very good as a chemical, as an ingredient, as a resource, because it's so easy to harvest, because it's so space efficient, because it's grown in places where labor is extremely cheap, and in a modern society where shipping overall is very efficient. It's incredibly hard to avoid, and it is in everything. It's even used as a feedstock for biofuel. And in case you're not exactly sure what that means, biofuels are sort of alternatives to petrol, which are made from sort of more natural, well, I don't know if natural is the right word, but stuff that is grown nowadays and not millions of years ago. Then you have to sort of give it a feedstock, which could be manure, or often corn is a very common feedstock, and it seems palm oil is being used for that as well.
Yeah. And you get like, and when we say palm oils and everything, like it means it's in everything. It's in makeup, it's in food, it's in, hold on, I had a list somewhere if I can find it.
Yeah, and stuff like makeup, you're not required to list the ingredients on makeup.
Exactly.
That's a secret. So unless you deliberately source from self-promoted sort of ethical brands that say on the packaging, like, we don't use palm oil or we don't test on animals, that sort of thing. Unless you have that, you'd actually sort of have to contact the company to actually find out if they use palm oil, if you're sort of trying to reduce that. So again, it's very difficult to, it's in everything, it's very difficult to avoid.
I remember seeing, I'm a member of Greenpeace and I get regular emails from them, and I remember seeing a couple of years ago, there was an advert by Iceland, the grocery supermarket chain, and they'd sort of gone out against palm oil. They'd spoken out against it. I think they were announcing some ban on it in their stores or something. And they had an advert, a bit bonkers, as adverts often are, about a orangutan in somebody's bedroom. But it was all about the different products that people don't often realise contain palm oil. And then when it was released on television, it was banned for being too political. I'll put it, maybe we could put it in the show notes later.
Yeah, I think I do remember that story, but is that too political, really? To just say that something's bad for the environment and that you're helping that? I don't know if I've seen the whole story, but that seems a bit wrong. I realise in retrospect that it does actually make some sort of sense. The ad was made in partnership with Greenpeace, which means that Greenpeace being a mostly political organisation, there's political aspect to that, as well as the political connotations of environmental issues such as trade with countries in Southeast Asia or other sort of things that affect other countries in a way that can be considered political. Furthermore, the huge publicity that this ad got after being banned was probably actually quite beneficial, as there was so many news stories about the ad being banned that it probably actually got more watch time and more attention than it would have otherwise.
It's very related to mindset, where people don't want to hear about it because they don't want to hear about how bad the world is, how badly the world is going.
People have a natural sort of conscience that they want to be good, and they don't really want to know how bad they actually are. This is the same thing with meat, is that many people just don't want to know what conditions are like in factory farms. If they buy a lot of cheap meat or go to McDonald's, they because people do have this sort of innate conscience, this innate, I want to say, goodness, that they don't necessarily want to feel responsible for animal suffering or anything of that kind, or environmental destruction, that they sort of just want to black it out. And so it can make people very angry if suddenly someone's sort of telling them all about how, the palm oil is so terrible for the environment and it's killing the orangutans and all of that.
Yeah, well, there's an end to that tactic, of course, which is just sort of is sticking your fingers in your ears and saying I'm not playing isn't going to work. But you can see why the public or a lot of people in the public want to do that, because it's a very scary crisis just all round, and with palm oil and all round that we're facing. And there's a lot of negativity in the media and in many places. Wherever you look, there's something to do with climate change or people starving in Iraq or whatever it is. It's a scary environment to live in.
Yeah, for sure.
And people just don't want to feel responsible.
Yeah.
So like I was saying, one of the problems with palm oil is how it's very good in a way, like not good for the environment, not good for the orangutans, but as a resource, it's actually hugely efficient. So compared to a different oil, like rapeseed oil, it actually takes up far less space to grow, to produce a certain amount of oil compared to other oils. The problem is obviously that the natural sort of environment that palm plants that flourish in is the tropical areas, which are being deforested due to maybe poor governance, unable to sort of stop the deforestation. A lot of it's illegal, cheap labor, but also just the fact that the sort of tropical areas is where palm is grown.
Yeah, well, maybe there would be, maybe there is room for palm oil if we maybe took it. I don't know if it's possible to take it into permaculture rather than a monoculture, because it does grow naturally in those areas as well. So I don't know if that's a possibility that's been looked into.
That's an interesting idea, because I suppose you could sort of have a sort of rainforest ecosystem and then some sort of way to harvest the palm plants within that, or to grow palm plants in harmony with other plants to sort of keep an ecosystem flourishing. So yeah, I guess while that could work in theory, maybe there's a way to sort of do this. And I know that there's many companies such as Nutella who are like still using palm oil, but it's some sort of certified sustainable palm oil. I'm not exactly sure what that means. But then I suppose that the fact that there's huge international demand means that to do that on a small agroforestry scale would be hugely difficult.
Yeah, well, I know they've been doing that with cocoa trees in some areas of Brazil. But the fact is, especially in Brazil, I don't know about Indonesia or other countries, but in those kind of countries where palm oil is heavily produced, the government isn't backing the environmental side of things because they want the economic benefits of the that the palm oil brings. And being developing countries, it's sort of hard to accept what the West demands of it in terms of eco-friendly palm oil and no deforestation, because then they're in such a tricky economic and social position.
That's so true, especially on a even sort of wider scope, is that the West was extremely bad with its sort of whole environment sort of thing and now they're sort of reforming and saying, oh, you should, we're all going to be carbon neutral by 2050. And then the developing countries feel like they've missed out on this huge sort of environmentally devastating development opportunity, and they're being told to sort of be green from the start. And that is ultimately very unfair on the developing countries, but there is also really nothing we could do, and it does end up falling on the consumer to demand sort of more sustainable products. I guess like in cocoa, chocolate, or in Nutella, palm oil sort of products, it turns out that the consumer has to sort of choose to pay more in order to sort of feel more responsible and to be more environmentally sustainable.
Yeah. Well, especially now that there's sort of this contrast between the West's way of doing things and then China's way of doing things, it's a lot more attractive for then these developing nations who are being asked so much by the West for their support and aid, that they're turning to China because China's aid hasn't got as many strings attached. And I was in Cambodia a couple of years ago, and everywhere you went, there was a railway, or there was a road, or there was something that was built by Chinese investors, and they basically owned half of Cambodia, which was slightly scary. It not just geopolitically, but also environmentally as well.
Yeah, I think Sandhya, Hisho, and I can all say the same thing about Malawi, is that a lot of the big infrastructure there was built by the Chinese, despite there being still a big Western presence, as Malawi is part of the Commonwealth. The Parliament building was built by China, and a lot of other sort of, was it the stadium and the airport, and maybe the airport was built in partnership with Japan, but
I think the stadium was China.
Yeah, definitely the Parliament and the stadium were built by China, and that's part of the Belt and Road Initiative, I suppose, of trying to exert Chinese influence, which is maybe, I'm saying this as a Westerner, but morally dubious compared to the West's intentions.
Yeah, well, there's plenty under the covers in the West as well.
Yeah, no, the West is not pure in intention, but yeah, and I'm certainly a biased person in saying that as well. And there's evidence for and against that sort of thing. But the West has more of a democratic style in what it wants to achieve in sort of having stable democracies in other countries compared to China, which is maybe trying to make Africa its China in the sense of that sort of low-cost production and buying countries' goodwill as opposed to sort of trying to make them better. I don't know. I don't have enough information to say that straight out, but...
Well, it is true that... that we were talking, when we talked to people there, they were really surprised that we would say not to take money from China, because it is the sort of dream scenario. There are very few strings attached, so there isn't any environmental, humanitarian, etc. Conditions, and it's big investments, and all in the end that they sort of stay out of your way. They own the airport, sure, but then you get to use these facilities, which are essential for developing nations. So it's quite hard to expect them to say no, despite you can see what's coming.
Yeah, it's very interesting, but we've gone off on a very side tangent.
Sorry about that.
But I'm sure the listeners will find it interesting, but I suppose we should probably keep on with palm oil.
Jinx.
So palm oil links back to so many other climate issues, and some of these examples are like deforestation, where you're burning forests to clear land to make these huge plantations for palm oil, especially in Indonesia. And in those areas, you've got those really, really carbon-rich peat soils and undergrowth of those forests that you're burning. And when you burn those, the peat soils, which collect like huge pockets of carbon, all of that carbon is released into the atmosphere, which is awful. It's essentially a fossil fuel.
Yeah, that's completely true, is that peat is sort of a bit like halfway to coal. It is that sort of compressed organic matter, but unlike coal, it hasn't been compressed over millions and millions of years. It's on a shorter time scale, and that's why it's at the surface generally. We were cycling for a holiday in the Outer Hebrides in Scotland, and there were no trees there. People would just cut up the peat from the ground. They would just cut up the ground into these little squares, and that's what they burnt in their fireplace, was peat. But peat is not just like a soil. It is really like a fossil fuel that you can burn. That's why it has so much energy, is it is this compressed organic matter. So burning these forests is not just burning the carbon stored in the wood, but possibly even more carbon is coming from burning the carbon in the ground.
Well, I was just going to say also, because peat is so carbon rich, it's a really good environment for plants to thrive in. So taking away that peat then makes it really hard to reforest that area, because the soil completely erodes. Because peat not only provides structure, it provides fertility, and it can change the ecology of a landscape completely.
That's a great point. Obviously, this is one of the biggest things that is focused on, is the destruction of habitats. So maybe the Iceland dad focused on orangutans, and that does seem to be by far the most focused on sort of thing, is, save the orangutans, save the Sumatran orangutans, all of loads and loads of campaigns. And maybe if I were to say one thing that students learn about in primary school from a climate change perspective, it would probably be the orangutans and the palm oil. But this sort of is eclipsing the whole problem, which is, yes, orangutans, which is an amazing species and should absolutely be protected. But it's not just about the orangutans, it's about this huge diversity of so many different types of animals and plants and reptiles and birds, and that sort of ecosystem all working together. That is what makes the rainforest ecosystem so beautiful and so amazing. And if we lose the orangutans, that's one species, but we are losing so many other species every day. It's crazy, and those species aren't coming back. So maybe we try to protect the orangutans, and when we do that, we want to protect this whole ecosystem from destruction. And it's already been destroyed so much, and there's so much beauty in so many different animals and plants and fungi working together as an ecosystem. It's more than just the orangutans.
That's something we will talk about a little more in detail in the insects and ecosystems episode, which is coming next, I think.
Well, I suppose the thing about orangutans, the reason that so many people focus on them is because they're a really good marketing point, because they're big primates, so they're quite, genetically they're quite similar to us, and people can get quite sentimentally attached to them because they're mammals, and it seems easier for human mind to do. So that's probably, and that's probably one of the main reason that they're being focused on so much, because they're such a good marketing point for, stopping palm oil.
Yeah, that's a good point, is that these charities that are all based around using, like, the WWF has the panda, and then there's many different organizations that would use the orangutan, and then with that sort of funding from the people who see the orangutans and go, oh, then we can focus on the bigger problem as a whole as well. So I think that's fine. That's perfectly fine. Like, that's not a huge problem with that, By protecting the ecosystem as a whole, you protect the orangutans as well, possibly more effectively than trying to tackle the problem from the top down.
Yeah, as long as you're aware that there is more than the orangutan that's under threat.
Yeah, for sure, definitely.
Yeah, this is not a simple problem.
No, not at all. I remember this from the Generation Days, Oscar, when
oh gosh, yes.
That's where I got the list of sticky names for palm oil. You released that at some point. And
seriously?
Yes.
Did I?
You did. I remember
When
that
was
very
that?
clearly in the Generation.
I mean, it's almost certainly copied from some website.
It is. I'm sure. I had to look it up, and I have a link for that as well. But
Good.
Palm oil, I remember you kept mentioning how palm oil isn't very efficient for carbon gathering because it's more related to grasses than actual trees. It's not like those large oaks that have huge carbon stores. They're not efficient at taking carbon out of the atmosphere. So even so you're burning those huge forests, and people argue, oh, they're planting more trees, but those palm trees aren't helping all that much, which is kind of unfortunate.
Yeah, I have zero recollection of that, but that sounds very interesting if it's more of a grass than a
Yeah,
tree.
I can send this. I found this. I had more research done to this, and I found a link that talked more about that. Let me find it, and I'll put it on the.
So, yeah, while you do that, I'll talk. Another problem with palm oil, like I said before, is that it is mainly extracted in countries with very cheap labor. And so then you can also have the problem of these sort of labor exploitation, exploiting people who are in poverty to try and make more money by selling this palm oil. So that's, I guess, a humanitarian issue as well as an environmental issue. And this sort of links back to what I talked about back on episode 1 of the podcast. Gosh, that was long ago, but I did just sort of re-edit that. If you want to listen to it, the audio sounds much better now. And we were talking about how cobalt mining in the DRC is a huge humanitarian issue as well with child labour. So I don't know if there's necessarily child labour in Indonesia and Malaysia and these sort of places, but there's definitely potential for sort of low wages and other bad working conditions. And obviously climate change is making it unbearably hot there as well.
I was reading an article in the Guardian lately. So just a newspaper, and it said that the Amazon rainforest has now become a producer of CO2, and I was wondering I wonder how much effect palm oil might have had on that, since you're saying that palm oil is more related to a grass than it is to a tree.
I don't know, do they grow palm oil in Brazil?
I think they do a little bit. If we look at our statistic thing from before, the map that I was looking at in the beginning, they do. It's on the lower side. It says 450,000 tons as of 2018.
Okay, so compared to the 70 million, that's about, what, 1/280th? So less than 1%. If you could find that Guardian article, we could link that in the show notes.
Palm oil refineries, and I have a link for this one as well. Palm oil refineries have released, you get the waste from the refineries that is like wastewater, and that releases methane, which, as we have discussed in past episodes, are like, is like, I think the article said, 4 times worse than carbon.
Oh, it's much more than 4 times worse. It's more like 80-something times worse. But you've got to sort of understand that it is more complicated than that. Methane, it has much more warming potential than carbon dioxide, like almost 100 times more. But it does sort of degrade, or it has the global warming potential is much higher because of the way that it sort of reflects light back or heat back to Earth. But it does sort of break apart within a more human time span, whereas carbon dioxide is effectively permanent. So that's just something to bear in mind.
Yeah, for sure. All right, so let's move on to the solution section now. Starting with the sustainable palm oil ?
Yes. Well, we can say that Nutella and many other products. By the way, I do hate Nutella. Hisham, I think, loves it. But do you guys like Nutella?
Nah.
Yeah, it's disgusting.
It's okay in certain circumstances.
The hazelnuts ruin it.
Why? No, I like the hazelnuts. It's the chocolate that's not as good.
Noisette. Are you kidding me? Chocolate's fine. Like, prefer dark chocolate or something, but
I really only like dark chocolate.
I do not want anything with noisette.
Hazelnuts are really good though, Oscar.
No, I don't like them.
Yeah, nothing better than a roast chestnut over the fire, I'd say.
Yeah, but chestnut is not a hazelnut. Chestnut's more like a conker, isn't it? Right?
Well, yeah, it is, but
How is this turned into a debate?
There you go.
on hazelnuts?
Great. Sustainable palm oil.
This is very relevant to palm oil, yeah.
So, sustainable palm oil, ? Like we were saying, like, before, in the problems section a little bit, with the Nutella and their,
Nutella.
And their, sustainable, palm oil that said they were using. And I think, there are a lot of articles that are like advertising scientists who are making alternate versions of palm oil. I saw one with like microalgae as an alternative to palm oil or something like that. And I mean,
seems a bit gimmicky.
Yeah. You have these solutions, but they're not always the best solutions, and they're not always ones that will be adopted by these large companies who are using palm oil for its effectiveness and its cheapness, I guess.
I doubt they'd be cheap or replicable on a large scale. I don't know where sustainable palm oil actually comes from, but I assume it must be from areas that are naturally suitable for that sort of palm oil production. I don't know, but it is certified by reputable corporations, so I think it is probably safe. But there is again the question that's the same sort of thing that you have with sort of sustainable fish, is that for it to be sustainable, it has to be on a smaller scale. So the only way for palm oil to be sustainable, if all the palm oil in the world was sustainable, I feel like it probably wouldn't be sustainable then, because we don't have the capacity to produce so much palm oil sustainably. So I think it is important to both only buy sustainable palm oil, but also to try and buy things that are made with not palm oil at all. But then you've also got this caveat, which is that other oils, such as rapeseed oil, such as soybean oil, are less efficient in terms of their land use compared to palm oil. So, and they are monocultures. So there isn't really a great solution. But I think it would be fair to say that sort of monocultures grown in sort of England, for example, like oats is an example. I don't think you can make oat oil, but I think you can go rapeseed in the UK. And that's probably more sustainable or more in tune with nature than sort of cutting down rainforests. But all agriculture is, well, a lot of agriculture, it's not exactly what nature originally was. And that's why permaculture and regenerative agriculture is so great, because that's more of a return to this sort of more ecosystems working together rather than a monoculture. But anyway.
Yeah. Past sustainable palm oil and that another solution, it was just not really a solution, would be to check packaging, get a list or something of those like secret sneaky names, and just
keep a couple in your head, because a lot of them are sort of variations. So if it has palm or stear, like stearic acid or stearate, or kernel, or if it just says vegetable oil, just plain vegetable oil, those are sort of maybe the 4 that you should look out for, rather than trying to memorize all 25.
I think we should keep in mind, I think I had a note back, oh my gosh, I can't speak, back up there, up in the show notes, earlier on in the show notes, yes, that sometimes vegetable oil and I think it's mainly just vegetable oil, but sometimes vegetable oil isn't always made from palm oil. Sometimes it can be other. But
if it isn't palm oil, then they might as well just list what oil it actually is.
Yeah, exactly. So you've got a bit of make sure you check the packaging. Try to avoid palm oil as much as possible. It is everywhere, we said before. Try to limit your consumption, maybe.
I don't know if this is something you've put in the show notes, but is there any research about how healthy palm oil is? Because if there was a movement that palm oil was unhealthy, that might provide another motivation for people not to buy products with it in.
Who just had a train go past them?
Oh, sorry, that was me. Our house is right next to a railway line.
Cool.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's no worry. So basically, I guess palm oil is absolutely a health concern. In that, when it's being consumed. What was that? More train?
Yeah, I think that's a freight train. I think it's carrying gravel somewhere. It's really annoying because all throughout the night they're idling and you can't sleep.
That's why we need electrification of the line to Oxford.
Yeah.
I think
I'll start again on my point about health.
I've just
Shall
looked
I
it
mute?
up, Oscar, on health.
No, it's no problem, because we all have headphones, so we can't. It's not going into our recording.
It's fine. Yeah.
Oh, okay, great.
Oscar, I've actually just looked it up. How healthy is palm oil? And just the first little, I guess, blurb that comes up on the first website is palm oil contains more saturated fat than olive oil and about the same amount as butter, but less than other tropical oils such as coconut oil. Palm oil contains monosaturated and polyunsaturated fats, which are known to be beneficial to health.
To be beneficial?
Yeah, apparently.
Yeah, well, so I guess a long time ago, well, a couple decades ago, the generic advice was that saturated fats are bad for your health. However, the new nutritional advice is actually suggesting that saturated fats can raise sort of large, low-density lipid cholesterol, which can actually sort of help prevent heart disease. So it's a bit of a tricky situation. But then again, I think originally people probably wouldn't have had too much of this sort of vegetable oils, maybe more sort of fats from meats, which are maybe more well-rounded in a way, and palm oil is more of a process to sort of isolate and have as such, which means it's more of a processed food, and that's not so good. And also the quantities in which it's consumed, like if you're just frying something, like deep frying, like that's clearly much more fat than you should probably have, and that's obviously fat is full of energy, which means that it has a huge amount of calories, and that can cause obesity because it's so easy to consume so much energy from those sort of oils. So maybe it's not like a carcinogen or anything, but it's not healthy to have in large quantities.
My dad has a friend who's got very involved in that movement you're talking about, that's recently emerged in the last decade, and he's every time my dad talks to him about it, he sends sort of 10 articles to him about how good fat is for you. But I noticed that he was really for the sort of tropical oils. He thought that rapeseed oil was bad, but that tropical oils, which contain high quantities of fat, like palm oil, were better for you. So that would agree with what you're saying.
It's a very interesting debate, honestly, with the
One big problem is that a lot of nutritional science is done with sort of more observational studies, where it's just like, yeah, let's just do a couple of surveys and see what the results are, rather than a more sort of the sort of trial you might do for medicine, which is more sort of clinical and more scientific and rigorous. So a lot of nutritional science is kind of flimsy, but it's very tricky to sort of find out all this stuff because people eat so many different things. It's difficult to sort of have a study where you only change one variable. But generally, newer studies are starting to suggest that fats actually aren't so bad for you. But obviously there is the concern of just overconsumption of calories in general as well.
Next in the show notes, I've written Convict Palm Oil, which is something it was mentioned, it's from the article that we're mentioning in the conclusion. So it's essentially, it's like, you know how like blood diamonds have like become this whole awful, everyone knows that's like such a bad thing. So Convict Palm Oil is like the oil produced at the expense of the rainforest and wildlife and enslaved workers in indigenous communities, and that's what Convict Palm Oil is. And it's kind of like the orangutan thing, but it's supposed to become this huge. When you hear like palm oil, you think absolutely not. That's bad. And
yeah, that sounds interesting.
And there's like companies that have been named for using Convict Palm Oil.
Yeah, sure. Name and shame.
Yeah, name and shame.
Never good for PR. You know, that sounds interesting. It's the same sort of things like we talked about, again, in episode 1, the cobalt, which is because of this ongoing civil war in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which is very undemocratic, but embroiled in the civil war. But yeah, that's another good marketing technique for environmental things, is make people feel guilty.
Yeah, using a humanitarian perspective.
Yeah, exactly.
Because I think if you ask people, they'd be much less aware of the humanitarian impacts of palm oil than they are of the environmental, and that might have a more profound effect on people's mindsets.
You'd hope that at least, right?
People's mindsets in this world are really messed up.
Yeah, awareness. If you're just generally aware of the problem, look out for companies that are known to use it. And I remember there was this Greenpeace video that was saying maybe boycotting is maybe not the best response, but instead to sort of, because it's such an individual small effect, but in general to sort of more activism and petitioning to try and get big companies that rely on palm oil to transition to something that's hopefully more sustainable.
I mentioned earlier that like with the checking packaging, how just try to limit your consumption. It's hard to avoid. It is everywhere, entirely everywhere.
And maybe it's a game of diminishing returns, is that if you could say cut out 80% of palm oil from like your general consumption, like across food and cosmetics and all that thing, if you could try and cut 80%, and like you don't have to worry about the last 20% because you need to put in like so much more effort to have so much less reward in terms of what you can cut out. But just to try and have like a couple of things that gets you most of the way there is generally more effective than trying to be completely cut out palm oil and like do crazy things for the tiniest little impact. So yeah, aim for like a couple of things to get you most of the way there in terms of reducing palm oil.
Yeah, for sure. Does anyone have any more points?
I don't have anything specifically. Taryn, do you have anything to add?
No, I don't think so.
So if you're interested in an interesting article, there's palm oil. What is it? Why is it killing our planet? How to avoid it? That's going to be linked in the description. We're not going to be doing the article club anymore, but we are going to be just giving you like an interesting article you might want to check out in your own time, because, you know, when we were doing the article club, it was basically just sort of half-heartedly mentioning, going over it, which wasn't really that good. So, you know, go have a look at it if you're interested, but we'll round off here.
Yeah, that article is actually the one that mentions the Convict Palm Oil, which is super interesting, so definitely go check that out.
Sounds cool. Go check it out, guys.
With that, I think we're going to wrap up the palm oil episode. Thank you so much for listening. Check out our Patreon, and Oscar, do you have anything else to plug? I know you probably do.
Yeah, just check out the links in the description. We've got sustainable merchandise made with renewable electricity. From $1 a month, you can get access to exclusive episodes, which we'll be making soon, as well as just supporting us, helping us to get microphones. That's sort of our goal. Proper microphones rather than just holding our phones awkwardly in front of our mouths. And then Instagram, Twitter, that sort of stuff. I know we've got a relatively large following on Instagram. Check out our Twitter as well. We do post some stuff there as well. Or the blog if you're interested in what happens behind the scenes of this podcast. Anyway, thank you so much. Thank you, Taryn, for coming on the show. This is the first time we've had an understudy on the show, and you spoke really, really well.
Thank you. It's been great to be here.
Awesome.
Great. Goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye. Thank you for listening.
Bye.
Bye.